We're all set up here today for further inspection on the CB750 engine. Welcome to Hack-A Week. So what's up in this episode? Inspection, that's what. We're going to take a look at the primary drive chain, see if there's any stretch on that, whether or not I need to replace it. The cam chain, we're going to look at that, see if that's stretched at all. And I'll also show you how I rounded up all of the bolts that I need for the crankcase halves to go together, and how I determined which ones go where. We're looking at the lower crankcase half here. This is the tensioner for the primary drive chain. What I'll do is get everything back together, put the top half of the crankcase back on, and then from underneath we're going to push that up, and we're going to look in the book on the specification as to how far that's allowed to go, and that'll tell me how much stretch there is in the chain. And I'll also need to check out the cam chain. That's the smaller one right here. The primary drive is 2 chains. And to do that, I'll have to go ahead and put everything temporarily together, slide the cylinders on, put the head in place, drop the camshaft in, and same kind of thing. We're going to look at the tensioners and how far they travel. That'll tell me if those 2 chains need to be replaced. Well, before we get into all that inspection over there, we're going to take a look on the bench here. I'll show you how I figured out which bolts go where in the crankcase out of all these miscellaneous bolts I have here. You can imagine when I first looked at this and I see all these bolts and all these holes in the crankcase, where do they go? Well, I went on House of Honda website. Any website that has OEM drawings will have a drawing like this. This shows you the bottom of the crankcase, and all these little numbers and lines point to the holes and what goes in there. So each one of these is a number on a list. For instance, let's take a look at these 2 right here. They're the same number, which shows that it needs a number 2 part and a number 4 part from our list. We'll go over here to the list. Let's look up number 2. Number 2 is a bolt hex 8 by 120. How about that? And we need 8 of those. So then I go over here to my pile of bolts, and if I look around through them and get out my calipers here that I've got set to 120 millimeters, well, look at that. You can see that that's 120. So that's the bolt that goes there. And then the other thing that goes with it was a washer right here, and that's how many of those you need. And so you can just use this list like this to determine exactly where all those bolts go. And when I got all done, out of all of these bolts that I have here, it turns out that I've got a lot of extras. I think, as I've said before, there's pretty much 2 of everything. I think this guy bought another bike and parted it out, or maybe had one he parted out, but that pile right there represents everything I need to bolt the case halves together. That's it. And then there was a few miscellaneous washers. I went to a hardware store and bought some good hardened washers for those rather than just cheapy ones. So that's the way that I figured out where the bolts go. You can do the same thing on probably any bike that you're putting together. If you've got a pile of parts that somebody else took apart, there's a good way to go about it. And there's also one for the top of the crankcase as well, and all of those bolts that go in there. In fact, every single thing on the bike is like that. So good little tip there to figure out where things go. Well, let's get back over to the engine now. Here's the crankshaft. What's going to happen now is I'm going to clean this all up, get all the dust off all the journals, and get all the dust off from all of the bearings everywhere, because this has been sitting out. I want to make sure that there's no little bits of anything in there at all. We're going to clean all that up really well. Then we're going to use some assembly lube, which is what this red stuff is that you already see in the engine the previous owner was using when he was putting it together. We're going to put assembly lube on every single bearing surface. Then we're going to go ahead and put the, let's see, we're going to put the transmission shaft back in right here. We're also going to put the crankshaft back in, and then we're going to, let's see, we're going to put the top of the crankcase on, and I'll probably just put a couple of bolts in there to hold it together. Then I'm going to thread the camshaft chain up through everything right here and just let it sit. And then the first thing we'll check is the primary drive chain, and then once we get that determined, we'll go ahead and slide on the cylinders, put on the cylinder head, get the cam in place, and we'll check out the cam chain. Just clean off all of these journals really well. Get all the dust, crud, everything out of the way. We don't want any contaminants in there at all. It's really important to keep everything clean on crankshaft and camshaft journals. And we'll wipe down all the bearing shells, get all the foreign matter out of there. Don't want anything in there. This stuff is really soft. You can scratch it with a fingernail even. Over here where the transmission shaft goes, those are ball bearings in there, and they will just drop right in, and I'm gonna just clean that off as well. We'll just wipe down the top of the case half. We don't want anything in there that could get squished between the two pieces and cause any damage. Clean, clean, clean. Everything nice and clean. And over here on the top of the crankcase, same thing. Let's just clean it all up really well. Now right here, there's these grooves that hold these bearings into place with a clip. Clip goes in there and it keeps the bearings from moving back and forth. I recently saw a post on one of the websites where someone asked why the transmission shaft was coming through the side of their engine after they did a rebuild. It was literally cracking, and pretty much figured what they did was probably left out those clips. Not a good thing. Let's get some assembly lube on each one of these. Stuff is pretty thick. Just put a little bit on each one. Just smear that around a little with my finger. You can see how stringy it is. It's really tenacious, and the idea of this, and the reason you put it on, is when you first crank over the engine, this will provide some lubrication until the oil pump gets primed and actually starts putting out oil pressure. Put a little bit of it on the fork, shift fork here as well. Give that just a little bit extra lube. Can't hurt a thing. Pretty much anything that spins around. The gears have already been lubed up pretty well. Now we're ready to drop the crankshaft in. Not literally drop, but gently place it in there. Okay, that looks good. We'll let the cam chain hang forward. We'll leave the primary drive chain alone for now, right here. And I'm going to grab the transmission shaft, and we've got to put the chain over the top of that. So what I'll do is just lift up the chain like this, get it threaded over everything, and get the chain on the sprockets. Make sure they're all still on the crankshaft. Bring it over here, being careful to line up everything. Make sure the shift fork is lined up. Get the gears moved around a little to where everything drops in. There we go. And we're in place. See how that will move back and forth like that? That's because these rings aren't holding anything yet. So the rings go in these grooves on the bearings. So we'll drop those in now. This one over here on the final drive, that one goes all the way around and holds that bearing in place from just pushing out. There's not a groove in the bearing on that one. We can skip that for now. We'll go ahead and put these other two in. There's 3 total, 3 bearings, 3 clips. When you drop the top case half on, You may have to move things back and forth a little bit to get those clips to line up properly in the grooves. A little bit of assembly lube on the top half of the case, on the top bearing shells. And same thing, we'll smear that in with the finger a little bit. Make sure it's covering the whole bearing surface. And we're ready to drop this thing onto the lower half. Okay, so I'm going to take the timing chain and just kind of let it sit like this. And I can reach down in there and pull it back up that way. It's out of the way of everything so that the case half will go right on there. I will get the case half over here and gently set it down on everything. And it'll just kind of drop into place on the alignment dowels. Now back here it's hanging up a little bit because I need to line up those grooves. Get a flashlight to take a look in here. It's got to go that way just a little bit. Still hanging up a little bit on one of them here. There it goes. Make sure it's down all the way. Now we'll reach in here and scoop up that timing chain. That's that. Okay, now we can get a couple of bolts into the crankcase halves to hold them together. Well, the previous owner built this this temporary stand. He welded it together, and the way it's designed, you can actually tip up the crankcase just like this. So I can get underneath here and put a few bolts in. And let's see, the ones I'm after are going to be these right here. And these right here. And I'm only after snug at this point, not torqued to spec. Just good and snug. All right. Now let's take a look at that primary drive and see what the slack is there. Okay, let's flip the entire thing over now. Carefully. Gotta make sure that I don't get this past the point of no return on my sawhorses here. Alright, let's get a closer look. So there's the primary drive chain, and right here is the tensioner. You can see that it can move a little bit. Right there. And what we're going to look at is a certain dimension between this edge and part of the tensioner. If we go over here to the manual, you can see right there exactly what's going on and where to put the vernier caliper to do the measurement. And I looked it up, and if it's 70 millimeters or more, time to replace the primary drive chains. So let's get in there and measure it up and see what we got. The place we want to measure is right there behind that wheel, that shiny flat surface that you see. And we want to measure there between that and the edge right here of the crankcase, and that's going to be our dimension that we're after. Okay, let's make sure we're set to 0. I'm going to use the depth gauge end here. Just push it down in there, make sure it's got full tension on it. Right there. And our measurement is 64 millimeters. So that's good. That means there's 6 millimeters left of wear in there. That's good. That's a primary drive that's in good shape. So that's good news. Now we can move on to the cam chain. I've looked through my books and I can't really find a specific measurement like with a depth gauge on the stretch on the cam chain. So what we'll do is we'll just put everything together and use the tensioner itself and the travel on there to determine how much wear is left. It does have a limit. It can only push the chain tension so far. So anyway, so we've got to assemble the cam chain tensioner. This is all brand new parts right here, and the way this is all going to go together is actually on the chain itself. You have to thread the chain through here, then you put all this stuff together. This little bushing right here has a notch in it on one side right there, and that notch will stick out and it will go into that little place right there on the roller holder, and that's what will keep that in place. And then these two guys, these two little rubber things, will insert here into the dowel pin, the shaft that goes through that tensioner, and that's what holds it in place in the crankshaft. So let's get a little different view here and we'll put it all together. Okay, here we go. So let's pull the chain up like this. We're going to take the tensioner and drop it on there like that. The small wheel will go toward the top, the big wheel towards the bottom, and the small wheel is outside the chain pointing toward the back of the bike. This flat section is what the tensioner pushes against. That points towards the back of the bike. And we'll take the lower wheel with that small insert in it, noting where the tab is. That little tab is facing towards me. We'll go ahead and push that in there and rotate it around until the little tab lines up. It's a little bit tricky. Another pair of hands would be nice. Okay, now we'll get the pin through there. You might have to wiggle the wheel back and forth a little bit to get it to poke through. Okay, that's through. Now we put the rubbers in, little rubber mounts, into the pin. They go a certain way so that they lock into place. It's pretty obvious. Now these will rotate around to where the flat side of the rubber is pointing up, and then it goes down here and it drops right into this spot on the crankcase very nicely, just like that. And you'll notice that they'll want to rotate a little bit, but when the cylinders are on there, they'll be held in place okay. Alright, so that takes care of the tensioner. Now what we need to do is slide the cylinder down onto this whole assembly, and we need to put the guide that goes here into the cylinder first. So let's go over to the other bench. So here we have the cylinder. Here's the guide. This is the pin for the guide, the lower pin. And these two parts right here, we're going to drop into the cylinder head and go into those slots right there. This is towards the front of the bike. This side with the raised groove on it, this little notch, that points towards the chain. So what we'll do is we'll just drop that in there like that. It drops into those two slots, so you can see that it's free to move around. Let's just turn this around, take the little pin, push it through the lower portion, center it up nicely. Now we'll take this and put it onto the crankcase. Now what you're after here is to get that pin that I just put through that lower tensioner to go right into these two grooves on the crankcase. Okay, now things get a little tricky here. This is where some assistance is nice. I wish I could get all these crows down here to help me. Anyway, I got a piece of copper wire on the chain here, and I'm going to thread that through the cylinder head down here where the chain would go, and then pull it up over the top, kind of hang on to it at the same time that we get the cylinder up onto the studs. I'm going to take this piece of wire and just bend it over. That'll hold the chain for me. Now I can line up the cylinder on the studs. Now you can imagine doing all this with the gaskets and everything in place, and then having to put pistons in and line up the rings and all that jazz. So that's why people have made that suggestion of making the wood blocks when it comes time to do the rings. Okay, so let's pull that up. Make sure that this is pushed in all the way. And we're going to also make sure that as we lower it down, everything clears okay. And let's not drop that chain. You may have to push the tensioner back a little. And then take a peek underneath. Make sure the tensioner's lining up in the slots. Or the guide, I mean. Make sure the guide is lined up in the slots. There we go. It's on there. So now I can take this piece of copper wire and just put it there to hold the chain in place for me for now. This is the cam chain tensioner. I'll loosen up this bolt right here and you can see that it can move in and out with that spring right there. So that's the maximum travel that we get right there. So what I can do is take my calipers, turn them on, zero them out, use the depth gauge, and since that's all the way out right now, I can poke the depth gauge down in there and get an idea of where that is, that dimension. That's about 23.5 millimeters, so let's just lock that down. Now we'll take this and we'll push it all the way back, tighten up the screw just a little bit, lock it in place, and then we'll put this onto the cylinder head and attach it with the bolts and tighten it down. Let's put the tensioner on there. We'll get some bolts in there to hold it in place. We'll spin those in. Just like everything else, we're only after snug right now. Don't have to be completely torqued down. This is just to check things out. All of this stuff is really worth doing, because if you do it later and you find out that the chain is stretched, you know, how much does that suck? You got all your gasket material on there and all that, and you've got to back up and do it all over again. Now we're ready to put the cylinder head on. I have two complete engine gasket sets. One of them has been opened, the other has not. So from the opened one I pulled out a head gasket because I want this thickness on here so that it raises the head up to the proper dimension that it will be when the engine's finally together, because that may affect a little bit of the tension on the chain. The further up it is, of course, the tighter the chain will be. I probably could have put the one down below the cylinder, the base gasket there, but it's pretty thin. I really don't think it would make that much difference. This one is almost a millimeter thick, so it's really worth taking the time to put it on. Alright, let's drop this in place. There we go. Now we'll get the cylinder up there. Same procedure, we're going to take this piece of copper and poke it through the cylinder head in the same location that the chain goes, and let's pull that through and bend the wire over. Now we can line up the studs. Where are you guys? Oops, that's okay because I got the wire there. Alright, pull that back up. Tricky. There's a lot to coordinate here when this goes together. Okay, that's in place. I just put these studs back in that were missing. These are what hold the cam holders in place, and I've got 4 nuts that I put on the head, on the studs. We'll just get those snug and that's what's going to hold the head in place for us while we do all this stuff. Now the cam holders, they have caps that go on them on the cam journals, and if you look on the end you'll see that they're marked with a stamp. This one says QX, that one says QX, and they only go one way. So as long as you keep them with the cam holders, you're pretty good to go. Over on this side it says XR, and this one is stamped XR, so it tells you where to put it and how it lines up. You match the letters with the letters. So that's that. What we'll do now is drop these into place on here. All of this is temporary, so that's how that's gonna go. Get these on this side. Okay. Now I wasn't sure which one of these was on the left and right side of the engine. So what I did was I took a look at the camshaft, and the tachometer drive goes over onto the right side of the bike, the side with the brake on it. And if I put it in here, I can look at the camshaft and you can see telltale wear signs on the camshaft, and usually you can match those up to the journals. This one right here has got a couple of little wear stripes in it, and so does the camshaft right here. So now I know that I've got these back exactly where they were. I'm going to pull off all of the rocker arms temporarily. This will just make things a lot easier to drop the cam in. It looks like they were just kind of dropped in place. Everything's already loose. And we want to keep those where they were as well. Try to keep everything right back where it was when you put an engine back together. Things tend to wear into each other, and it's best to try to put them back that way. So you pull out those two and then slide this out the other end. Almost lost my chain there. And as I said, we'll keep those down here on the bench, keep them in order. Before we can get that camshaft in now, we need to back off the cam tensioner. We'll just leave those bolts in, but back it off all the way. You can remove it as well, because we need as much slack in the chain as we can get. Now we'll take the cam sprocket, put it onto the camshaft, wiggle it around there. This is where things get really fun. You got the sprocket slid onto the camshaft, okay? Drive gear for the tach over on the right side of the bike, and we're going to just take this whole assembly and start working it through the chain. And it's a little bit of a wrestling match. You have to turn the cam a little bit, turn the chain a little, take your time, keep working your way through till you get over here where the cam will almost drop into place. Now take this part of the chain, pull it all the way forward, get it onto the tensioner, and get the sprocket started there. Alright, now you want to wiggle the camshaft in such a way so that the two mounting flanges over here, they're pointing like this. That allows you to have the proper clearance that you need to mess around with this sprocket and get it started onto the chain. It's really tricky. It can get pretty frustrating, and probably get a little bit easier when I've got the head torqued down just that little bit extra, and that head gasket is squished just a little bit more. When it comes time to do this and actually get the timing all right on this, it's going to be a lot of fun. So anyway, now what I want to do, that I've got that much of the chain started, is give the camshaft a little push. Now it's down into the journals all the way, and I can wiggle this around a little bit. And what I want to do is I got to get this part of the chain over here forward. It'll clear everything. This part of the chain is as far that way as I can get it. I start working it around, and there it goes. It drops on at that point. Now you slide this up onto the camshaft, and then you rotate the camshaft around till it's lined up on those two holes, and you can get your bolts in. Now when you do this and you're timing the cam, it's in a whole different position than this. But for now, we're just going to run one bolt in. And we're not even really going to tighten it up much. It's just got to be on there so that the cam sprocket's held in place. And I can already tell that this is going to be just fine, because over here on the tensioner, everything looks pretty good. I mean, it's got tension on it right now. In fact, I had to back it out and take it out in order to put this thing on. So no problem there. That's a good chain. Good deal. We're making some progress. I have now verified that the final drive chains are in good shape and the cam chain is virtually brand new. It looks new, and I'm pretty sure now that that's indeed the case. So let's see what'll be next after all of this. I think in the next episode we'll be bolting the two case halves together. Get all that stuff in the lower end all worked out, bolted together, put some Honda Bond on there to seal it all up, and we can write that one off. Then we can work our way up from there. So good progress this week. Thanks for watching. Thanks for all the donations and support. And until next time. And bend it over the cylinder. Oh, jeez. That sucked.